Wherever Marx's ideas were practiced, life got worse. Not by a little, but by a lot. There is not a single exception to this rule. Not the Soviet Union, not Eastern Europe, not China, not North Korea, not Vietnam, not Cuba, not Venezuela, not Bolivia, not Zimbabwe. Wherever Marxism goes, economic collapse, terror, and famine follow.
It is persistently stated that wherever socialism has been tried, it has not been successful. Wherever communism and anarchism have been tried, they have somehow failed. And often it goes without citation, or even proper elaboration. It's just put like it's a blatant fact. What's there to deny? This is a widely accepted belief, so therefore it must be right. Well, if you actually bothered to look into the individual examples of communes being established with these ideological principles of economic structure and democratic sustainability put in place, you'll actually find quite the opposite of this claim. That these societies were successful. Not only successful, but far better as alternatives to the current capitalist state societies that we live in. Now, the claim comes from mostly ignorance, not lies. There are some people who lie, and there are some people who were just misguided. And this originally came about as Cold War propaganda during the Soviet-American wars. And this conflict, this waging of violence against each nation, it perpetrated many myths and lies about modern-day socialism, but also the socialism that has been implemented countless times in the past. The reason for this was to paint socialism, of course, in a very unflattering light, to make it look displeasing, to make it appear distasteful to the general public, by selectively taking examples of, say, less successful countries in the United States, and then using them as a basis to say socialism hasn't worked. This isn't taking into account all the poor, extremely impoverished capitalist countries that exist today and have existed in either better or worse conditions in the past, while this claim was being mainly perpetrated. Nonetheless, no matter what decade it's being perpetrated, it's a false claim. Socialism has not only worked, it's perhaps even exceeded its original expectations. And this is coming from studies relating to a sociological economic theory, that of socialism and that of communism. You don't really expect theories to work in practice on wide-scale bases, such as the establishment and justification for the existence of entire countries, but you see them with communism and socialism, nonetheless. I want to break up this explanation of history into many segmented parts. First, I'm going to begin with the Republic of Cuba. This was before Cuba became a state socialist country. And when people think of socialist countries today, Cuba is the first that comes to mind. It is a government-created economy, a government-planned economy. Everything is centralized by the state. This means that the state controls the means of production. Its control over the economy includes massive monopolies, industries, and otherwise profitable businesses that the state could utilize in order to wheel in money, either through the use of income tax, corporate tax, or for the sake of giving back to the general community. In order for Cuba to have become the socialist state it was now, it had to undergo the Cuban Revolution. This occurred in 1959, following Marxist revolutionary Che Guevara, famous today for his brave leadership in defeating capitalist forces. In order for Cuba's industries to have been nationalized as they are now, a military coup broke out. And this, just like any gun war between different opposing factions, resulted in bloodshed. But it was a bloodshed necessary in order to eventually liberate the economy and the country and its people and its proletariat in order to serve for better wages, socialized healthcare, socialized medicines, vaccines, better education, deprivatizing major industries and industrial complexes, and hiring the general quality of life, which can be reflected today in the sense that prior to Cuba's liberation, it stood out as no different in terms of poverty with the rest of the countries in the Caribbean and Latin America. Now it does stand out as a bit of a shining jewel amongst this region. Not exactly by any standards a rich country, but that's because it developed by different historical circumstances. It developed under circumstances which were different from that of the United States, and were different from that of Qatar, or Saudi Arabia, or Italy. You understand? You have to look at the history of these things to understand what exactly got a country into the state it is now. Negative effects, positive effects, who knows? Cuba has a Human Development Index rating of 777, which is above countries like Mexico, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Venezuela, Brazil, Macedonia, Armenia, Ukraine, Peru, and Colombia, all capitalist states. In terms of life expectancy, due to the good health conditions most of its citizens live in, the average Cuban actually lives longer than the average American, and has been doing so only a few years after the revolution has passed. Prior to that, Cubans lived half of what they do now, less than half even. Cuba also manages to have a lower homicide rate compared to the United States, at 4.99 murders per capita compared to 5.35 murders per capita in America. When taking into account the distribution of wealth in America, which is extremely uneven, Cuba actually equals out in terms of the actual amount of wealth the citizens hold. In fact, one could even make the argument that Cuba is wealthier than America based upon how much property the average person owns, and they're allowed to own it in bigger quantities due to deprivatization of major industries and their property they produce, meaning certain services are available to the public, ones that are life-saving and ones that are for comfort, both maintained either cooperatively by mutual non-hierarchical agreements in terms of trade, service, and helping one's community, or the state itself supplying its citizens with the means to survive, but to also survive in comfort. Compare Cuba to the majority of the world, the planet. It's doing far above average. In fact, not just far above average, when placed upon a global scale, one could even make the argument Cuba is an extremely wealthy country. Extremely wealthy. And I wouldn't even deny that. Consider how poor the actual world is and how much this is hidden from you. How few dollars people actually make a day. How little even live on a minimum wage, even a small minimum wage. They live on practically nothing. Cuba, when you really think about it, is extraordinarily prosperous. This is just how much capitalism has taken from the world, especially the third world, where a state like Cuba, even in its current condition, appears a beacon of hope. Che Guevara once stated, "Man truly achieves his full human condition when he produces without being compelled by the physical necessity of selling himself as a commodity." This line of thought, not selling oneself out to private owners, allowed the standard of living in Cuba to rise, eventually leading to far less unemployment and a faster pace of economic growth. Another important historical figure in Cuba's socialist history was Fidel Castro. He fought American imperialism. He campaigned for Cuba to be as independent as possible and to stay away from the corrupt, imperialistic, and ever so scheming United States, as he saw the country naturally as untrustworthy down to the core. American values were not Cuban values, and he knew this very well. Cuba was to be an independent state going by its own economic rules, its own ideas for regulation, for profit, and how people will go about business. It did not follow the Western model, let alone the model that the United States used. And this was during the same time as the Cold War, so of course they were peered, eye-to-eye enemies of one another. Cuba didn't have as much power as the Soviet Union, however, so there was no big massive assault between the two. However, the Soviet Union did indeed back Cuba, and actually financially supported it up until its dissolution, in which Cuba's economic growth stagnated and then began to fall, because it relied so heavily upon trade between the Soviet Union and itself. However, it did get back up on the bargain again and decided to, in a non-conventional manner, achieve economic growth and progress by giving more power to the workers, that is, within workplace democracies, separately scattered across the many workplaces found within metropolitan cities in Cuba. Fidel Castro, but unlike Che Guevara, he was an actual prime minister, serving Cuba from 1959 to 1976, and then as president from 1976 to 2008. He implemented his Marxist theories through the Communist Party that governed Cuba to influence the socialist economy, nationalizing as many businesses and industries as possible, with the state controlling the means of production economy and assuring good health, good working conditions, and properly paid labor for all its citizens. No exploitation whatsoever existed under the system because it was a system that was consistent. Every business was based upon the same rules and the same structure. Nobody could break the barriers. There was no deviation from the norm. And to some, one may say, well, no businesses would be able to reach sky high in terms of their economic growth or how many people they pull in. But in doing so, that means they would have to deprive other businesses of their customers and their money. So in the end, it actually works out better this way. More people make money with mutual agreements between citizens, the workers, and the state. Nothing is coerced in this context. One of the great things Che Guevara set himself to, that he personally campaigned for, was to erase illiteracy in the Republic of Cuba. This happened straight off after the Cuban Revolution, when the Communist Party had complete control over the country and its citizens. It began on January the 1st and ended on the 22nd of December. And with this short span of time, it was the world's most successful eradication of illiteracy. Before 1959, the official literacy rate for Cuba was between 60% and 76%, largely because of lack of education access in rural areas and a lack of instructors. This was before Cuba adopted universal public education. As a result, the Cuban government of Fidel Castro, at Che Guevara's behest, dubbed 1961 the Year of Education and sent literacy brigades out onto the countryside to construct schools, train new educators, and teach the predominantly illiterate peasants to read and write. The campaign was a remarkable success. By its completion, 707,202 adults were taught to read and write, raising the national literacy rate to 96%. So at minimum, in less than a year's time, Cuba's literacy rate rose by 20%, either 20% to 36% at most. And by 1986, it was nearly 100%. Today, it stands at 99.8%, one of the best in the world. Think of the 781 million people worldwide who aren't guaranteed basic education, who aren't guaranteed literacy. They're illiterate. They're not born into countries in which education is a universal human right, in which it's either provided by taxes or it's provided by the community as a whole, meaning that people volunteer for the good of society because they care about the people and the children and the youth who want to grow up provided the basic necessity of communication through writing, through that expression of written language, through script. It's one thing to never guarantee a person a job, which is already disgusting on its own, but there's another thing to not even give people the skills necessary to get that job. If private owners want successful workers, and they want as many workers as possible in order to boost their own revenue, then they want people that are literate. Certain jobs require this. A lot of jobs require this. So many impoverished countries where education is privatized. So many countries which don't have this as a universal right. Large portions of their population, their national populations, miss out on this opportunity. They miss out on a life, in essence really, a life that could be spent learning, educating oneself, participating in the world, communicating better, that is through written language. Because capitalism is a system of privatization, but also private ownership of schools, universities, and institutes, it's a game rigged in favor of the capitalists. It's a game rigged in favor of profit, and not actually bettering society for the most amount of people. What Cuba have managed to do by guaranteeing people jobs, by giving people healthcare, by giving people public education, it has made itself stand out amongst the rest of Latin America through kindness, not through this ill-defined, misguided drive for profit that capitalist nations all across the continent have utilized over the past century or two. Ever since Spanish colonization, and also Portuguese colonization in the case of Brazil, Latin America and the Caribbean has been nothing but a breeding ground for neoliberalism, economic globalization, and the takeover of banks, services, and the economy by private sector corruption. During the run of the Soviet Union, life expectancy rapidly rose. In 1938, the life expectancy for the average Soviet citizen was 46.9 years, being raised to 67 years in 1959. And at its peak, 1968, the average life expectancy for the territory reached 69.6 years. Out of all the Soviet countries across Eastern Europe, Armenia had the highest life expectancy at 73.3 years, with the lowest being Turkmenistan at 64.8 years per citizen. Mortality rates overall dropped, with the total amount of children dying before the age of 1, as that marks their birthday, plummeting per year. This was gradually de-escalating over a long period of time, ever since the Soviet Union was formed. This was because, due to socialized medicine, vaccines, and deprivatizing major resources, more Russian families, and many families all across Soviet countries, were able to afford to properly feed their youth. Household purchases in retail markets actually grew, where the average Soviet would be able to purchase more as time went on. They had a larger abundance of wealth, a larger abundance of what was at the time still mostly private property. Though privatization went down overall, major resources that people need to keep themselves alive, such as food, water, and medicine, that is most medicine, were still mostly privatized. Mutual aid was not a common factor within the Soviet Union. However, due to a larger amount of freedom given to the workers because of more opportunities opened with the state, and a wider range of choices to pick from in terms of job opportunities, the average Soviet would be able to afford far more, because they were given greater, better alternatives to what they used to have in pre-Soviet Russia. That is, where private owners set requirements and qualifications for certain jobs, and a lot of the time they couldn't apply for these because these required certain degrees in education or skill in a certain category, so they would go for essentially peasant work. Here, the average worker was treated like anyone else, treated and respected in the most egalitarian fashion imaginable. They weren't put on this pedestal of competition. There wasn't this hierarchy to try and get better, when the mark was to get every individual Soviet as equal as possible, but also give them a living wage, a life worth living as well. Someone, say a man for instance, the working class average man in the Soviet Union, enough money from his work, which was still wage labor nonetheless, to be able to provide for his loved ones. And this was the same with women who wanted careers. They were given far more opportunities than they had prior to the existence of the Soviet Union. And in this time, as life expectancy grew, rose, and as the quality of life also increased, the market was allowed to thrive based upon the state's control of it. The state would supply what used to be private businesses with the necessary means to function, such as necessary supplies, public bank loans, in order for these businesses to be more successful. When the Soviet Union fell, so did the nation's GDP per capita. It rapidly plummeted until eventually gaining ground as productivity rose once again. However, if this had never happened, productivity today would be much higher, and the average worker would be paid far more. There'd also be far less economic inequality. In 1820, Russia accounted for 5.4% of the world's economy. In 1870, it accounted for 7.6%, and 8.6% in 1913. The Soviet Union represented 20% of the world's economy in 1966, its highest point. And at the year of its dissolution, 1991, only produced 7.58% of the world's economy, its lowest point. In 2012, Russia's share was 2.82%, highest point, and reached the nadir in 1998, 1.38%, before ending up at 1.9% in 2010. Growth and productivity was actually higher under the Soviet Union than it is in Russia today, or any former Soviet country across the region of Eastern Europe. When measured with other OECD countries, it actually topped above average, meaning its productivity tended to expand at a rate much faster than most countries across the European continent. Also, when measured for per capita, countries like America and Australia. And when compared to the third world, Russia was far remarkably above average. In fact, Russia's GDP per capita, and general wealth, and also the distribution of wealth, which was much more even under the Soviet Union, was far above the world average, so much so that the rest of the world didn't even compare. Soviet states, during their run, were actually wealthier than countries within Eastern Europe who were not part of the Soviet Union, those who did not embrace state socialism. Russia, after the Soviet Union collapsed, dipped below the world's average GDP per capita, and became what one could consider globally poor, or at least objectively below average. In today's Russia, 10% of the population, the wealthiest of the country, control 89% of the country's wealth. And this inequality is only growing as neoliberal capitalism develops and poisons the once pure region of Eastern Europe. Now you may be thinking to yourself, what about the famines? What about the purges? What about all the disease and suffering that occurred under the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin's rule? Well, firstly, I would neglect the idea that there was a particular regime responsible for this. I mean, you have to look at things from every side, diagonally, horizontally, whatever the case. Joseph Stalin ruled Russia, ruled the Soviet Union, brought it to the peak of wealth, brought it to the prosperity that it could under the conditions of such a vast set of lands actually. Consider that Russia is one of the most sparsely populated countries on Earth, and at the time was less populated. There was a fair portion of the population living in, say, Siberia, for example, or just very sparsely populated, rural, non-urban territories across the country, and the many Soviet countries, which were also very sparsely populated, especially at the time. They died from not having basic human needs because there were no needs to be acquired in the locations they were settled in. They didn't get around because there was nothing to get around with. They were trapped in the wilderness, or they were trapped in some poor, unindustrialized rural village. So for instance, in the context of Ukraine, there are a lot of people who yap on about the Holodomor. Well, look what socialism did. Look what Joseph Stalin allowed to happen. But you have to take into account that the reason this occurred to begin with was because basic human necessities such as food, water, shelter, healthcare, heating, and clothing were all privatized. You had to pay for them. They weren't paid through tax dollars, and they weren't provided to the community for free by the community and all that, where people would exchange things in a routine fashion. Essentially what I'm describing is mutual aid, where people, not expecting anything in return, help one another out and actually do get things in return. But it's not the same as economic trade. You put something on the table, and then you take whatever you want, or at least to the extent that everyone in equal distribution can have enough property to survive and also be comfortable surviving as well. Which could easily happen. But you have to understand that certain rural areas where there are practically no supplies cannot do this. They can't really exist under any economic system, really. At least not successfully, anyway. The case of the Holodomor was the case of privatization killing millions of people. The Ukrainian peasants hadn't access to food, they hadn't access to water, or even clothing for that matter, so they died. That's what happens when you don't even get grains in your system, let alone bread. Peter Kropotkin, famous, influential, anarcho-communist philosopher, pointed out in his book The Conquest of Bread that while living in his rural town, his rural village in Russia, and this was before the Soviet Union by the way, he himself saw privatization as the issue because private property was inherently the hoarding of goods and services that were necessary for a community to survive, and there was an unequal amount of people holding these resources. He wanted people to work to the extent they felt comfortable, and give to the community and receive from the community in accordance to one's ability and in accordance to one's needs. And this would be applied collectively to any commune. So just take Kropotkin's words. He was correct. Based upon this analysis, we can safely say the Holodomor was an example of capitalism taking away one's right to survive. Under socialism, where the workers would control the means of production, and I'm talking about libertarian socialism, not state socialism, the workers could figure out what's right for them. Nothing would be privatized. All the property that's available within a town, a village, for instance, will be available to the general community, to the wider public. It will be commonly owned property. That's the thing with collectivizing property. Not only does it allow more people to own it, it doesn't allow unused property to go to waste. Think about all the homes, all the housing in America that nobody uses. Peopleless homes. Now consider how many homeless people there are. There's enough shelter for everyone. But not if you allow greedy millionaires to hoard all the property for themselves, despite not actually inhabiting any of it. Okay, so famines aside because they were clearly a result of capitalism, what about the Great Purges by the Soviet Union? What about political suppression in, say, Mao Zedong? Fuck. What about political repression under the Soviet Union? What about censorship? What about attacking of counter-revolutionaries? Well, firstly, these are counter-revolutionaries. It's not just holding a different opinion, it's being terrorists. It's going against the government, going against the state and the people and the socialist laws in place. Now, in terms of the Great Purges, however, I think this is just really simple to summarize. Just like the classicide, or however you pronounce it, in Mao Zedong's China, the People's Republic of China, during the time, it was with landlords there, and in the Soviet Union, it was with wealthy kulaks. And essentially you had wealthy private property owning peasants who hoarded property, who abused land privatization, and controlled settlements scattered all over Russia. It was natural to decentralize the power they held, that is true, the state, coming in and intervening, and taking away their wage slaves and making them a fellow man, equal. If a kulak, a wealthy peasant, a capitalist, a private owner, were to revolt against this, violently that is, refuse to give out the property that they didn't earn, that was likely stolen from somebody who actually built the settlement, in their own time, and actually put effort into it, then they would be killed, they would be shot. But that's justifiable, because it's trying to make things more economically equal. Trust me, more people are going to die. Well, firstly, the death toll racks up anyway when peasants refuse to cooperate, so that's already their problem. But more people are going to die when they lack basic resources. When you hoard all this wealth, especially food, things like food to keep yourself alive, the majority are going to be far worse off. The Soviet state intervened in these practices, these unethical practices, by property owners in order to ensure good health and vitality to everyone within their country. They're dismantling this hierarchy of one person owning everyone else as their private slaves, now making them no more than their fellow man and woman, making them an average human being. And this is what you should do, because these kulaks are not contributing to society whatsoever. They were capitalists who fed off of other people's work and collected paychecks for themselves.
Do I need to point out that 56% of Russians thought life was better under the USSR? I'm just gonna leave it there.
Moving on to the People's Republic of China, and the legacy left behind from it. It's interesting when we talk about state employment versus private employment, because how a worker goes about getting employed in these different sectors is actually rather interesting, and this especially ties into youth unemployment that we see rampant in Western countries today. If somebody wanted a job in the People's Republic of China the same way that somebody would want a job in the Soviet Union, they could just have a job because the state would automatically assign you this. This is because the state needs employment in order for its economy to grow. A state socialist society needs as many workers employed by the state under state sector jobs, companies run by the state and monopolized and nationalized by them, in order to build up a quantity of wealth. And some of that wealth is distributed to the people, such as the money that the workers take home after long months of work. But a fair portion of that goes to taxes, and a fairer portion of that goes into publicly held banks, in which the government store money away for things that they personally need to spend it on. In the case of getting a job, all you would have to do is show up to a state-sponsored work program, a certain workplace, a certain area for you to go about your job, and then you would just work. So when it comes to unemployment, if you did find anybody unemployed in the People's Republic of China or the Soviet Union, it was either one of the two reasons for it, well actually 3 reasons. 1, they chose this life, and that's just a lifestyle decision. 2, they had cognitive, mental, or physical disabilities which prevented them from working. Or 3, they were living off of welfare and social security that the state provided them. That is not much money overall, especially if you look at the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. You weren't really given that much welfare income due to the countries not being as wealthy as, say, the United States or most of Western Europe. However, in terms of the wealth distribution at the time, things were very economically equal. This was after a long period of economic inequality and private property abuse of private property, and utilization by the ruling class, the employing class, and just general private owners to hoard as much wealth and keep it away from the peasants and the people as possible. What Mao Zedong did when he came into power, he not only made things more equal, but he gave people better pay rises in the state sector. State-funded programs actually pay far more in today's China. Not only that, but when working for these state sector programs, workers are actually guaranteed certain benefits that other workers aren't. Better access to healthcare, more leisure time, and other benefits including more vacation days, time off of work in the case of pregnancy. These other benefits, right? Including welfare and social security benefits that come down to the net average of the average Chinese citizen. So what you have here is that you have all these backup features, all these extras added onto your overall paycheck, which is much higher than what you would be guaranteed in the private sector. But also, the private sector is inconsistent, because private owners can set whatever wages they believe are correct for you. If they believe you should be paid a certain amount based upon what they have and what they've guaranteed themselves over a long amount of time, building up wealth and maintaining that wealth and only doing it for self-interest, then things are going to be inconsistent. One business that is practically the same thing will pay you differently from the other, despite the fact that you're doing the same work and you're putting in the same amount of hours. In the case of the state, however, things are equal because they're managed in a way in which each workspace and each individual facility meant for laboring is kept in equal condition. Because there's not this massive amount of Chinese workers who are kept under these horrible conditions under the state, because the state is democratically working things out with the workers themselves. If you are a wage laborer, then in this workplace democracy established and set up for you, you have a right over what kind of working hours you would like to pick, as long as it matches that of the mandatory requirements the state has set prior to your employment. With private owners, however, they work out your hours individually and independently. You don't really get a say over it. They choose which days you work and for how long you work. In terms of state work, however, it's just that you need to work a certain amount of hours to get paid. So, let's say for instance, somebody works a month in the state sector compared to the private sector. That month can be spent independently however one wishes. It can be spent over months, actually spanned that amount of time, or it could be done in 1 week if one is willing to put in about 4 times the amount of hours one would for an average month. But it could happen over 4 months, right? In which you put less work in for that time period. However, because this is China and because people are struggling to make a living wage, usually the case is people work very long hours, even under the state sector, in order to receive very little pay. And the reason this is the case is because, due to privatization, including rent, which costs quite a lot, the average Chinese family, the average Chinese household, is very much struggling to get by, to feed themselves, to put meat on the table, and also afford gas bills, electricity bills, water, so forth, hospital bills, healthcare. Though socialization is happening, including that of socialization for healthcare, and this has happened in many regions across China, this predominantly occurred, the massive leap forward to nationalization by public industries came about with Mao Zedong's rise to power. And as the leading chairman, few know this, but a lot of his political influence, his philosophy, actually derives from the work of Peter Kropotkin, in not necessarily the element of anarchism, as he was very much in favor of the state. We're talking about authoritarian socialism here, not libertarian socialism. He did take a lot of influence by how things are so uneven through the existence of private property, that by deprivatizing major industries and nationalizing them by the government, people were able to lift themselves out of poverty. And we see the effects of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward and the positive consequences that came with the economic revolution in today's society, that is modern day China. Consider that before the 21st century, within the People's Republic of China, the GDP per capita, when considering for the average Chinese citizen, was under $4,000, taking into account international dollars and economic exchange. In the year 2001, even if we take the lowest estimate, we can at least say that the average person employed by the state sector, working in the public sector of China's workers' industry, received at least 3 times that amount, at around $12,000, or more. That is, to put it at minimum. And this is taking into account the same kind of jobs that anybody did in the private sector. Because of nationalization and working for the state, as opposed to private owners, this created the only real economic inequality at the time, which related to an imbalance from those employed in the public sector and those employed in the private sector. Because when we consider how high the wages were in the public sector and how many people were employed within them, it goes to show just how impoverished people were working under bosses, working under capitalism. They were just scraping by on the lowest wages possible. For a society that barely guarantees its citizens decent wages, that is outside of anything that the government can provide. There does exist cooperatives in China, and they're very efficient, more efficient than the state, but because the state decides, willingly so, not to fund them and not invest money into them because they're not linked, they don't own these industries and they'd rather put money into their own, these cooperatives don't get the necessary funding, meaning the economic growth that they deserve, in order to actually take off, which is why they're generally unpopular amongst the general Chinese population. Under Chairman Mao, life expectancy rapidly grew as industrialization took hold of the nation of China. In 1960, the average life expectancy for an inhabitant of China was 43.73 years. By 1970, it had grown above the world average, at 59.09 years. And all the way up until Mao's death, in 1976, the life expectancy was 64.63 years, far above the world average, at only 61.46 years. Today, due to government nationalization of resources, China's life expectancy stands at 76.22 years, compared with the world average of 72.04 years. In 1947 in China, only 20% of the population could read, were illiterate. But 30 years later, as time went on, 65.5% were able to read in the year 1979. This came with land reform and improving the status and rights of women in China all across the nation. Because of China's economic reforms under the Mao era, with Mao Zedong changing up the once privatized main major industries that controlled most of China's stock exchange, nationalizing that to state-controlled monopolies, one of the important things during his reign, during his rule, was establishing gender equality between men and women, and giving women equal rights in not only the market, not only the state sector, but in general everyday life. He promoted women's entry into the labor force in particular, trying to get them into the everyday kind of work that men participated in. Not just for being housewives, not just for being homemakers, but being workers, being laborers, and having just as many opportunities as men in the same economic field. In fact, the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, at the time, in 1954, explicitly stated that women and men should have equal rights. To promote gender equality, the Communist Party promoted the slogan, "Women hold up half the sky," to illustrate the importance of women for China's economic growth and success. In order to realize gender equality fully between men and women within China, the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Government implemented policies ensuring equal pay for equal work, as well as equal opportunities for men and women. Prior to this, gender-based discrimination was completely legal in the People's Republic of China. A private industry was allowed to discriminate against women, for instance, for whatever reasons it deemed okay. It could fire women, sack women, give them worse working conditions, give them lower wages, subject them to conditions of sexual harassment, horrible things that Mao Zedong outlawed in this society. And this is the thing with egalitarianism and socialism. You can't be pro-capitalism and say, well, I'm pro-capitalism, but I'm against racism. Or I'm pro-capitalism, and I'm against, sexism and transphobia. You can't say these things. Because in private industries, you're essentially saying, well, I'm against discrimination, but I think it should be legal. I think, let private industries do whatever they want. Because these industries operated without regulations, privately owned monopolies, ones that were for profit, were operating without any regulations by the community or the state, and could get away with subjecting its workers to horrible conditions and discriminating against its workers for whatever reasons it deemed okay, it was allowed to get away with these things. If you support racial equality, then in the workplace, somebody shouldn't get less rights or be given less opportunities because they're of a different race or a different ethnic group or anything like that. But under laissez-faireism, under laissez-faire capitalism, where there are no regulations, where everything is completely privatized, you can't have this. You can't be against this because you would have to inevitably promote it. You would have to say, this is okay that this industry is discriminating against this demographic because it belongs to them, even though it should rightfully belong to the workers, since the workers are the ones actually putting in the work, while private owners do quite literally nothing but boss people around and make people's lives miserable by setting their working hours, their pay, their workplace conditions, and forcing them to do mandatory overtime cleanups. So, in the case of China, and in the case of nationalization at the time, this was a massive step forward for women who were being underpaid despite doing the exact same work for the exact same hours. Another thing that was established during Mao Zedong's rule over the People's Republic of China, and also by the Chinese Communist Party, was giving marital leave for women, daycare time, and prohibiting arranged marriages. This also meant the selling of women was prohibited, alongside prostitution. This was because private brothels in particular would exploit women in not just forms of sexual harassment, but outright rape. And this was an epidemic at the time until things were legislated, more regulations came in, and eventually taking away all the horrible mistreatment of the workers, of sex workers in particular. China was able to lift women out of these horrible conditions and give them good paying, decent living wages for fair, dignifying, respectful work. The same work that men do, not having to sell oneself out to private owners, sexually selling one's body in order to put meat on the table and in order to survive in this horrible capitalist world we live in. And that's what capitalism does. It forces you into these horrible positions of doing either immoral or degrading things to others or to yourself. Why private owners don't just assign you work, even though they could get money off of it, is because this helps out other private owners. And this is a mutual contract between private businesses. If you don't guarantee somebody employment, and this is the case with the private sector, they're going to become desperate. They have no job. Finding the worst job is better than no job whatsoever, at least to them. They'll do it for low pay, horrible working conditions, no guarantees or insurance. They'll go ahead and do it. They'll do whatever horrible work a private owner has set for them. And so this is why the private sector does not guarantee employment, unlike the public sector. You aren't guaranteed anything. And because you're not entitled to basic human rights, they're going to lure you into this trap of being paid $1 a day. And you think to yourself, well, being paid $1 a day to commit 15 hours per day of work every day of the year, I suppose that's enough to survive. It's better than no job whatsoever. And of course you would rationally think that, but that's because you're not given any better alternatives. None of these alternatives are presented to you whatsoever. And this is what Mao Zedong fixed. He eradicated this issue by guaranteeing people employment, a living wage, decent rights and labor conditions, and decent workplaces. This can be looked back at in what we call today gender studies, more specifically Eastern-styled gender studies. And I think that despite the hatred gender studies often get, all they really are a retrospective at certain parts of history in which women had no rights prior to a takeover, and then had been given rights, or at least made things more equal than they were before. And I completely for studying this category of history. I find it very interesting myself. What was good about China under Mao Zedong was the lack of pollution. This is a big deal. This was before private property, in the context of owning certain settlements and monopolies, the means of production, was permitted. That is, by the Chinese government. And so you wouldn't have these big monopolies, these private factories producing chemicals and toxins, releasing that into the air for entire cities of people to breathe in, thus causing a lot of death. Quite a lot. In fact, every year, approximately 1.6 million people across China die from pollution-related effects, as pollution has rapidly gotten out of control, and it's increasing. Entire cities are covered in nothing but dust and fog and smoke. Entire cities ruined to the point where people have to evacuate and leave their city that they lived in for years, including all the property they bought there that they can't transport because they have to leave quickly before they die due to smoke and fog and inhaling horrible, harmful toxins and chemicals that are found in the air that fall down to meet ground level. These people have to move away from these cities are gone. But worst of all, that workers have to work in conditions in which they're frequently exposed to radioactive material, an environment completely polluted. The northern half of China, which has roughly around 500 million residents, during the 1990s, a loss of more than 2.5 billion years were taken away. That loss created by the effects of pollution, by private monopolies making private profit off of destroying the environment, making everybody's lives hazardous and horrible. This includes the pollution of the ocean, rivers, lakes, contamination of otherwise completely drinkable water, and destruction of human lungs. Life expectancy in the northern region of China is actually 5.5 years lower due to the effects of pollution. So people are living 5.5 years less, their life expectancy plummeting because of the hazardous effects that pollution is causing. And this did not occur to any extent under the rule of Mao Zedong, when private monopolies were not allowed, let alone allowed to pollute people and kill people in this way, but exist altogether. Everything was taken over by the state. In the year 1978, 100% of employees were employed in the public sector. That is state-governed work. But after certain economic reforms were launched over time, by the year 1995, that rate went down to 56.4%, and then completely plummeted to 32.8% in 2003. However, it has increased yet again, going back up to 50% in 2012, though that does leave a lot of room for private monopolies to spawn and to completely destroy the environment, eradicating any chance of living in a city that would once be clean, but is now completely taken over by fog, and the workers having to wage labor in these horrible conditions, worse than they already were, it's beyond cruelty. It's genocide, but in a slow, torturous sense. It's a long genocide, paced out, stretched over a long period of suffering and death under what is capitalism, something that was not allowed private ownership over the means of production prior to economic reforms, which inevitably shaped the country for the worst. And it's not just China, it's every country in the world. It was found that 95% of the world's population live in areas where breathing, where the oxygen you consume is unsafe to some extent or another. Of course, this varies. It varies very much, to the point where the most polluted countries on the earth nowadays are India, China, Russia, and Somalia. These are the results that one would expect to see. Not to mention that due to pollution, on a global perspective, 1 year of the average human being's life expectancy is lost worldwide. But there's more. It gets far worse in terms of the amount of people killed on a global scale when it comes to pollution, when it comes to climate change effects that are caused by private industries that are a result of capitalism allowing its roots to sink into the earth. Pollution kills worldwide an estimate of 9 million people per year. Disease caused by pollution, in 2015 for example, was responsible for this. 16% of all deaths worldwide. I presume they're referring to preventable deaths though. 3 times more than AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. Not to mention that malaria is a preventable disease, which only exists because of capitalism, or else we would be able to fix it with vaccines, which we can. It is curable, it just costs money, so not everybody can be cured. And 15 times more than all wars and other forms of violence. It kills more people than smoking, hunger, and natural disasters. Even though hunger is a result of capitalism, yes, and there's no such thing as a natural disaster. That relates to climate change, which is caused by capitalism as well. In some countries, it accounts for 1 in 4 deaths. pollution disproportionately kills the poor and the vulnerable. Nearly 92% of pollution-related deaths occur in low and middle-income countries. India and China hit the worst of all. There's also a lot of health spending that pollution inevitably leads to, some of which is taken out of people's pockets through taxes. Other times, the government has to spend money it could otherwise give to the poor on fixing the disaster that is climate change, and also trying to fix their cities and clean them up and, stop pollution and all that. Something that they allow to happen in the first place. So really, they're killing themselves and they're killing their own business. Welfare losses due to pollution are estimated to amount to $4.6 trillion every year, which is 6.2% of the global economic output. One may make the argument that since the economic reforms in the People's Republic of China, the GDP per capita has drastically risen. So, doesn't this mean that capitalism is getting people out of poverty and increasing wealth? And well, firstly, you have to take into account the distribution of wealth. This is just looking at the GDP per capita, which is distributed unevenly. So if a bunch of rich people are getting way richer and they're a small minority of the overall economic population, then it doesn't really count. And of course, in more capitalistic countries, and with countries with higher rates of privatization, this is bound to occur. Because these people aren't getting rich based upon hard work or merit, they're doing so by exploiting the benefits of private property, which disadvantage everyone else. On top of this, the reason that the wealth has spiked upwards is mostly due to the advancements in industrialized agriculture occurring throughout China. Nothing to do with socialism, nothing to do with capitalism. This is because the country of China wanted less people to be working in factories and in mining industries and these sort of positions, and wanted them to be more nature-based, more environmental, wanting them to be scattered a bit more and to have more opportunities. So of course this is bringing in more money. But who owns the money? That's the thing. Not many people actually receive it, unfortunately. What about the Great Leap Forward? I heard that killed a lot of people. Well, yeah, you heard from biased sources. It's stated that between the years 1958 to 1962, anywhere from 23 million to 55 million people in China perished due to economic reforms. I'm not talking about capitalist reforms, we're talking about socialist reforms launched by Mao Zedong and launched by the Chinese Communist Party. However, when we look at the population growth of China, seeing that it was growing from anywhere between 10 to 11 million people per year, I think it's pretty much impossible that many people died in this period of time. I mean, you're telling me that even at minimum, 23 million people died in 4 years, while the population grew about 10 to 11 million per year? I think it's complete nonsense. But even if they did die, just hypothetically, you would have to explain to me how it had anything to do with socialism, how it had anything to do with social reforms, that is to the economy. Nobody has done this yet. Of course I haven't. It was most likely a result of privatization because basic human needs, food, water, shelter, healthcare, were privatized, including vaccines as well. So I presume this is what killed them. Also, these long working hours that were set by the government and people dying from exhaustion and overworking themselves through wage labor, it's hierarchical, it's not democratic, it's not a participational democracy, is it? So it doesn't suit my needs, it's not what I advocate for, so it's irrelevant pointing it out anyway. What about the anti-rightist campaign throughout the People's Republic of China from 1957 to 1959, you may ask? And I would like to say that this certain topic, this period of history, in relation to these campaigns that were hosted by the Chinese Communist Party, are very under-researched. There's not much evidence to support any point of view. All it states, and all I've read, is that there are apparently purges against right-thinking individuals who went against the Chinese Communist Party, or people who believed in capitalism and agreed with it and wanted private property rights and were against nationalization and collectivization. This is interesting because the claim is that 550,000 people died, but I don't really see any evidence for this because it sounds big, but the research just isn't there to really prove anything. If there were people who went against the government violently in the forms of terrorism, then it was merely self-defense. That is from the Communist Party of China. If it was killing people based upon their beliefs, I'm against that, and I think I would denounce it if there were really any evidence to suggest it. If people were forced into labor camps or were executed by the government, that's terrible, that's immoral. It's just that you can't really claim that's the case when the statement, there was a bunch of rightists who were purged, a bunch of Chinese conservatives or whatever. It's kind of vague, it's kind of broad, and I can't really find any examples of this. Which is weird because you would expect this to be more researched. Presuming these people were killed, however, presuming all of them were killed, maybe it was because they died like everyone else, from labor, from privatization, as opposed to simply being rightists. Perhaps they were simply labeled as such, happened to have died later, and then the claim was they were killed because of their political beliefs, which I doubt to be the case. Now there is one thing that I will put out there that was terrible about the People's Republic of China at the time, was indeed part of the Cultural Revolution. In part. See, the Cultural Revolution's main peak, its purpose, was to bring a culture of the proletariat, swapping it out from some of the old religious traditionalist ideas and characteristics of Chinese culture. And these traditional characteristics, conventionally, are what we associate with Chinese culture today, at least most people in the West, seeing that the proletarian culture has sort of died down now, unfortunately. Understand that this was a period of socialist realism. It was a period of Soviet-inspired art. It was a period around the Great Leap Forward. If you can't already tell, I very much like this type of art. I think it perfectly reflects both peace and yet revolution. I don't know how it does that, but it just does. It just fits so well. The way everything is drawn, depicted. It was a period centered around the man, the myth, the legend, Mao Zedong, and his policies. It was supposed to replace nonsense traditionalism, which served no purpose of the people, and instead tried to create an identity, fashioning that identity out of blood, sweat, and tears from the workers, out of the workers having control, out of the workers revolting against their bosses, their employers, and finding new work within the state. And this was eventually to achieve communism, stateless communism, at least that's how it's phrased often. It was meant to be a transition from state socialism to workers' self-management with the complete eradication of all private property. Now, the issue arises when they went to, and I'm talking about the people employed by the government, the Communist Party of China, many important monumental Confucianist sites, including graveyards, and started vandalizing them. They vandalized non-socialist art. They vandalized religious monuments and buildings, and even churches. And this got China a rather anti-Christian record. Now, I'm no fan of Christianity. Quite the opposite, actually. But I don't think people deserve to be purged because they're Christians or Confucianists, which was often the case in these situations. However, I would like to point out that this had nothing to do with communism or socialism. It is part in anarchism, it's a big part of anarchism, I might say, and a belief that anarchists hold today, that religion, Abrahamic, monotheistic religions, or polytheistic religions, or any religion where one worships a deity, are being ruled by that deity, thus it is creating a hierarchy. A deity is a ruler over you. And this is one of the reasons I'm an atheist, and I don't follow any religion, and I never have. But the case is, these people were not anarchists. They were quite the opposite. They obsessed over the state. They just really wanted to replace the old Chinese culture with proletarian culture. The reason so many communists throughout history have been atheists doesn't relate to economics, I assure you. It relates to the fact that these people were, in a sense, progressives. They were fighting against the traditional conservative stances of the old world. And of course they wouldn't have fallen to the norm. Back at the time, it was a norm. It was normality to be a Christian or a Confucianist or a Buddhist. It was the norm for these people. And essentially they wanted to reject that. They didn't want the state to be interfered with by the churches. They wanted to separate churches from the state. It's the same with synagogues, mosques, any kind of religious place of worship. They didn't want any of that influence, that religious influence, to interfere with the state, and intervene in what should be a culture, a people, driven by workers' rights and trying to make life more bearable for the workers, and to give them more control. At least eventually that was the case. Seeing Mao Zedong's China would be 3 times poorer if he hadn't nationalized all that he did, and he hadn't outlawed private ownership over the means of production for a certain period of time. China would be far more hungry, far more thirsty, far more dying of diseases. So you can't claim socialism hurt this country, when indeed it was capitalism that hurt this country. And it's the same with the Soviet Union. In fact, when you take a look at the calorie intake, and you take into account the economic growth that the country went through at the time, when you consider how developed it was, it actually has a higher calorie intake per person. Do the basic mathematics. Consider that these countries weren't nearly as developed, industrialized, and economically sound as, say, the United States or Canada. Yet, these former socialist states, when taking this into account, were far healthier, were far less hungry, in comparison to their relative wealth. I want to bring everything back to this one statistic I'm showing on screen right now. Between the years 1960 to 1985, based upon one estimate, the USSR was actually less hungry than the United States, had a higher per capita calorie intake than the average American. The average Soviet was healthier, was better fed. But again, it's one estimate. This is, of course, based upon other estimates. Now, it could be inaccurate, and that's fairly possible. It might be off. However, the fact that even a misestimate could get this close pretty much shatters the entire mass starvation, famine, hunger narrative that the right like to play up. Based upon other estimates, the USSR comes really close, comes slightly behind or slightly forward, above, and there are multiple estimates to take from. Another, in 1976, puts calorie intake 50 calories less in the USSR. When it comes to basic human needs it takes to survive, bread, cereals, meats, protein, fish, milk, eggs, these sort of things, vegetables, the USSR had an abundance of this, and so did the US. But it really comes down to the rate and level of privatization. How many people have access to these goods and services? How many people have access to this property? Because economic inequality was so bad in the US, with everything considered, it would make more sense to assume the Soviet Union was doing better. The people there were doing better. Look, I'm no tanky. I know I might, come off as tanky because of the fact that I'm, pointing out these obvious things that anybody could just look up. People could do their own research. Don't just listen to right-wing propaganda all the time. But I don't actually think that Stalin, Mao Zedong, Lenin, whoever, did nothing wrong or anything like that. No, these people were flawed. The fact that anybody died under their country proves it such. But the flaws come from allowing capitalism to grow. It comes from maintaining and permitting privatization. My criticism of these people was that they weren't socialistic enough. Not at all. And I would prefer that the workers control their own labor, are entitled to their labor. I advocate for workers' self-management. The state is just another, while preferable, nonetheless, hierarchy, another hierarchy at the end of the day. It's a lot better to private owners controlling it all, but it's not the end goal of what most socialists, at least in the West, advocate for.